Sometimes the only choice you have is the one everyone tells you not to make. Maya Carter knew that feeling all too well. A single mother with nowhere left to turn, she inherited her great-aunt's old cabin when the eviction notice came. The townsfolk of Cedar Hollow laughed at her misfortune, calling the place cursed and warning her to stay away. The cabin sat at the forest's edge, twisted and weathered, with windows like hollow eyes. Vines choked the porch, and the roof sagged from years of neglect. But Maya had no other options. The moment she and 8-year-old Marcus stepped through that warped front door, everything changed. The air turned cold and thick. Shadows moved where no light should cast them. And from deep within the walls came whispers that almost sounded like her name. What was her great-aunt hiding in this forgotten place? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maya Carter had always been a fighter, but by 32, she felt like she was losing every battle that mattered. The divorce papers still sat crisp and final in her purse, alongside the eviction notice that had arrived 3 days after her ex-husband stopped sending support. She worked double shifts at St. Mary's Hospital, her nursing scrubs always smelling of antiseptic and exhaustion, but it wasn't enough. Nothing was ever enough anymore. The call from the lawyer had come on a Tuesday morning while she was helping Marcus with his math homework at their kitchen table in the cramped apartment they'd called home for 2 years. The place smelled like the Chinese restaurant downstairs, and the walls were thin enough that they could hear Mrs. Chen arguing with her son about money every evening. Maya had answered the phone expecting another bill collector, but instead heard the measured voice of attorney Benjamin Hollis telling her about great-aunt Rosalie's passing and an inheritance she never expected. "Your great-aunt left you her property in Cedar Hollow," he'd said, his tone suggesting this wasn't necessarily good news. "I have to tell you, Ms. Carter, the locals have some superstitions about the place. Been sitting empty since she passed 6 months ago. Nobody's been willing to maintain it." Maya had barely remembered great-aunt Rosalie, a distant relative who sent Christmas cards with cramped handwriting and $5 bills tucked inside. She'd attended maybe 3 family gatherings, where Rosalie sat in the corner, speaking to Maya's grandmother in hushed tones about things that made the older woman cross herself and change the subject. But family was family, and now Rosalie had left Maya something when she had nothing left to lose. Marcus looked up from his homework, his dark eyes serious behind the glasses that made him look older than 8. He had his father's height and Maya's stubborn chin, but there was something gentle about him that reminded her of her own father, a man who died too young, leaving behind only memories of bedtime stories and the smell of Old Spice. "Mama, what's an inheritance?" Marcus asked, and Maya realized she'd been staring at the eviction notice while the lawyer waited on the phone. "It means someone left us something," she said, making her decision in that instant. What choice did she have? "Mr. Hollis, when can we see the property?" The drive to Cedar Hollow took 3 hours through winding mountain roads that seemed to lead deeper into a world Maya had forgotten existed. She'd grown up in cities, where problems had solutions and neighbors minded their own business. Here, the trees pressed close to the road like curious onlookers, and the few houses they passed sat far apart, as if the residents preferred solitude to company. Marcus had fallen asleep in the back seat somewhere near the 2nd hour, his sketchbook open on his lap to a drawing of their old apartment building. The boy drew everything, their life in pictures that somehow made their struggles look beautiful. Maya caught glimpses of his latest work in the rearview mirror, careful pencil lines depicting their tiny kitchen, complete with the crack in the ceiling that looked like a river on a map. Cedar Hollow wasn't much of a town, just a cluster of buildings around a single main street that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1960s. There was a general store, a diner called Martha's with gingham curtains in the windows, a small library, and a gas station that doubled as the local gathering spot. Maya pulled up to the station to ask for directions, and the conversation died the moment she walked through the door. The attendant was a weathered man in his 60s with calloused hands and eyes that seemed to measure people before deciding whether they were worth acknowledging. When Maya mentioned she was looking for the Rosalie Carter place, his expression shifted from polite indifference to something that might have been pity. "You'd be the niece then," he said, not making it a question. "I'm Carl Brennan. Run this place for 30 years. He gestured toward the other customers, 2 women in their 50s and a younger man in work clothes who had stopped pretending they weren't listening. "This here's my wife, June. Martha Henderson, who runs the diner, and Tom Birch. Does handyman work around town?" Maya felt the weight of their collective attention. The way people study something they're not sure about. It reminded her of the first day at a new school, when you walk into the cafeteria and realize everyone already knows something you don't. "I was wondering if you could give me directions to the property," Maya said, keeping her voice steady and professional, the way she did when dealing with difficult patients. Martha Henderson, a sturdy woman with grey hair pulled back in a practical bun, exchanged glances with the others before stepping forward. She had kind eyes, the sort that had seen enough of life to offer compassion without judgment. "Honey, I knew your great-aunt Rosalie for 40 years, Martha said gently. "She was a good woman, but that place she lived in, well, it's been trouble for longer than any of us have been alive. You might want to consider selling it without even seeing it. There are folks who'd buy it just for the land." "What kind of trouble?" Maya asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Tom Birch, a lean man in his 30s with working man's hands and an easy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, cleared his throat. "It's just old, that's all. Been in your family for generations, but it's seen better days. Foundation problems, electrical issues, probably needs a new roof. The kind of work that costs more than the place is worth." But Maya caught the look that passed between Martha and Carl, the way June suddenly became very interested in rearranging the candy display by the register. "This wasn't about foundation problems. I'd like to see it anyway," Maya said. "We've come a long way." Carl gave her directions that involved landmarks instead of street names, past the old Miller farm, through the covered bridge, up the hill, until you see the stone wall that runs along the Peterson property. The cabin sat another half-mile beyond that, where the road ended and the real forest began. Maya thanked them and headed back to the car, where Marcus had woken up and was pressing his nose against the window, watching a group of children play in the small park across the street. They stopped their game to stare back at him, and Maya saw the familiar look of curiosity mixed with the wariness that came with being different in a small place. "They don't have many new people here, do they, Mama?" Marcus said as they drove away. "No, baby, I don't think they do." The directions led them through countryside that grew wilder with each mile. The road narrowed from asphalt to gravel to what was barely more than 2 tire tracks through the trees. Maya's old Honda struggled with the incline, and she found herself holding her breath every time they rounded a curve, half expecting the path to simply end in a wall of forest. When they finally reached the property, Maya understood why the townspeople had looked at her with pity. The cabin squatted in a clearing that seemed too small for the enormous trees surrounding it, as if the forest had been slowly reclaiming the space over decades. What had once been a proper yard was now a tangle of wild growth, with old rose bushes gone feral and walkways disappearing under creeping vines. The structure itself was a study in gradual surrender to time and weather, built from logs that had darkened to the color of old blood. The cabin sagged in places where the foundation had settled unevenly. The wraparound porch tilted at an angle that made Maya think of a ship listing in rough seas. Shingles had fallen from the roof, leaving patches of exposed wood that looked like scars. Windows stared out from beneath the drooping eaves, their glass so dirty it was impossible to see what lay beyond. But it was more than the physical decay that made Maya's stomach tighten with unease. There was something about the place that felt wrong, as if the very air held a weight that pressed against her chest. No birds sang in the massive oaks that formed a cathedral around the clearing. No insects buzzed in the tall grass. Even the wind seemed to die away as they sat in the car, studying their inheritance. It looked sad, Marcus said quietly, and Maya realized that was exactly right. The cabin didn't just look abandoned, it looked lonely, like something that had been waiting far too long for someone to come home. Maya pulled the keys from her purse. Heavy, old-fashioned things that the lawyer had given her, along with a manila envelope of documents she hadn't had time to examine. The largest key was ornate brass, worn smooth by decades of use. The others were more modern, though none looked recent. "Well," she said, trying to inject some optimism into her voice for Marcus's sake, "at least it's ours." They climbed out of the car, and Maya immediately noticed how much cooler it was here than it had been just a mile down the road. The temperature seemed to drop with each step toward the porch, and by the time they reached the front door, she could see her breath forming small clouds in the air. The porch boards groaned under their weight, some giving more than others in a way that made Maya test each step carefully. The front door was solid oak, carved with decorative panels that had once been beautiful, but now served mainly as places for spider webs to anchor. The brass key turned easily in the lock, as if it had been waiting for exactly this moment. Maya pushed the door open and stepped into the smell of dust, and time and something else, something that reminded her of the way the air smells just before a thunderstorm, electric and full of potential. The interior was larger than she'd expected, with a main room that served as both living and dining area, dominated by a massive stone fireplace that looked like it could heat half the building. Furniture sat covered in white sheets that had yellowed with age, creating ghostly shapes in the dim light that filtered through dirty windows. A staircase along the far wall led to what she assumed was a loft bedroom. Marcus stayed close to her side as they explored, his usual chatter replaced by an unusual quiet. Maya could feel him tense every time a floorboard creaked, or a sheet stirred in a draught she couldn't locate. The boy was sensitive to atmospheres, always had been. He'd been the first to know when his father was thinking about leaving. Sensing the change in household dynamics months before, Maya admitted the signs were there. In what appeared to be the kitchen, Maya found an old wood stove and a hand-pumped well that she hoped still worked. No electricity that she could see, which explained why the place had felt so isolated. But there were oil lamps positioned throughout the rooms, and when she tried one of the pumps, clear water flowed freely. "We can make this work," she told Marcus, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to convince him or herself. It was in the main room, behind a sheet-covered bookshelf, that Maya found the first artifact that would change everything. A dusty cardboard box containing what appeared to be family documents. At the top of the pile was a birth certificate for Rosalie May Carter, born in this very cabin on March 15th, 1923. Below that were more certificates, marriage licenses, death records, a paper trail of family history that Maya had never known existed. But it was a photograph near the bottom of the box that made her hands tremble. It showed a young black woman standing in front of the cabin, but the cabin in the picture looked nothing like the decrepit structure they'd just entered. In the photograph, it was pristine, surrounded by a well-tended garden, and looking like the kind of home people dreamed of building in the mountains. The woman in the picture had Maya's eyes and Marcus's gentle smile. On the back, in the same cramped handwriting Maya remembered from Christmas cards, someone had written, "Rosalie Carter, age 20, 1943, the year I learned what we're really here for." Maya showed the photograph to Marcus, who studied it with the serious attention he gave to all pictures, as if trying to understand the story they told. "She looks like us," he said finally. "She was family," Maya replied, though something about the photograph bothered her. The woman's smile seemed forced, and her hands were positioned oddly, as if she was holding something the camera couldn't see. As the sun began to set behind the massive trees, Maya realized they'd have to spend the night. She'd packed sleeping bags and basic supplies, hoping for the best, but preparing for camping if necessary. They rolled out their bedding in the main room near the fireplace, and Maya managed to get a fire started using old newspapers and kindling she found in a wooden box nearby. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and for the first time since they'd arrived, The place felt almost welcoming. Almost. Marcus fell asleep quickly, exhausted by the long day and the emotional weight of leaving everything familiar behind. Maya sat by the fire, studying the family documents and trying to piece together a history no one had ever shared with her. According to the papers, her family had owned this land for over a century, with the property passing from generation to generation through a complex web of inheritances and legal arrangements. But there were gaps in the record that troubled her. Long periods where no one seemed to live on the property, followed by sudden returns. Deaths that occurred at relatively young ages. And strangest of all, a pattern of single women inheriting the place. As if the land itself chose who would be its next caretaker, Maya was still reading when she heard the first whisper. It came from somewhere deep within the walls, so soft she almost convinced herself it was the wind moving through the old timbers. But wind doesn't form words, and she could have sworn she heard her name being called from somewhere far away, not outside the cabin, but from somewhere deeper, as if the voice was rising from the very foundation of the place. She looked over at Marcus, but he was sleeping peacefully, his sketchbook open beside him to a drawing he'd made earlier. In the firelight she could see he'd drawn the cabin, but not as it appeared now. His version showed it as it had been in the old photograph, beautiful, welcoming, surrounded by gardens, and looking like a place where families could be happy. Maya closed the documents and tried to settle down to sleep, but the whispers continued throughout the night. Sometimes they seemed to come from the walls, sometimes from beneath the floorboards, and once, just before dawn, she could have sworn she heard someone calling her name from the loft above. But when she climbed the stairs to investigate, she found only an empty room with a single window that looked out over the dark forest, and the growing certainty that Great Aunt Rosalie had left her much more than just a place to live. As the first light of morning filtered through the dirty windows, Maya made a decision that would bind her fate to this place forever. She would stay. She would make this work. She would give Marcus the home and stability he deserved, no matter what secrets the cabin held. She had no way of knowing that the cabin had been waiting for exactly that decision, or that her choice to stay had just activated something that had been sleeping in the deep places beneath the earth for far too long. The inheritance, Maya was beginning to understand, came with responsibilities no lawyer had mentioned and a price that hadn't been listed in any legal document. But by then, it was already too late to change her mind. Maya woke to the sound of Marcus screaming. She bolted upright from her sleeping bag, heart hammering as she searched the dim morning light for her son. He sat rigid against the far wall, eyes wide and fixed on something she couldn't see, his small body trembling like a leaf in a storm. "Marcus!" She scrambled across the room and pulled him into her arms. "Baby, what's wrong?" "The lady," he whispered against her shoulder. "The sad lady in my dream. She was calling my name, but when I tried to answer, she got scared and ran away." Maya held him tighter, feeling the rapid beat of his heart against her chest. Children had nightmares. It was normal, especially after a day as overwhelming as yesterday. But something cold settled in her stomach as she remembered the whispers she'd heard throughout the night, whispers that had definitely included her name. "It was just a dream, sweetheart. New places can make our minds play tricks on us." But as she spoke the words, Maya found herself scanning the room for any sign of disturbance, any indication that something had been there with them during the night. The fire had died to cold ashes, and in the grey morning light, the cabin felt even more oppressive than it had the evening before. After a breakfast of granola bars and water from the hand pump, Maya decided they needed to establish some normalcy as quickly as possible. She'd found cleaning supplies in the general store yesterday, and if they were going to make this place home, it needed to feel less like a mausoleum and more like somewhere people actually lived. But first, she needed to understand what she was dealing with. While Marcus sat at the kitchen table, drawing pictures of the cabin when it was happy, Maya began a systematic exploration of their new home. She'd been too overwhelmed yesterday to notice the details. But now she forced herself to look at everything with a nurse's trained eye for observation. The main room was approximately 30 feet by 20, with hand-hewn log walls that showed the skill of whoever had built this place. The stone fireplace dominated the north wall, its hearth blackened by decades of use. But as Maya examined it more closely, she noticed something strange, scratch marks in the stone, as if something with claws had tried to climb up from inside the chimney. She dismissed the thought immediately. Animals got trapped in chimneys all the time. Raccoons, birds, even the occasional bat. But the scratches looked deliberate, almost like letters or symbols she couldn't read. The kitchen revealed more oddities. The cabinets were built with exceptional craftsmanship, but several of the drawers had been reinforced with iron brackets that seemed far too heavy for storing dishes or utensils. One entire wall was covered with what appeared to be salt lines, white, crystalline residue that someone had carefully spread. Along the baseboards and windowsills, Maya knelt and touched the substance with her finger. It tasted like salt, but there was something else mixed in, herbs maybe, or some kind of mineral she didn't recognize. Whatever it was, someone had applied it methodically, as if following specific instructions. "Mama?" Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding his sketchbook. "I drew something weird." Maya looked at his latest drawing and felt her breath catch. It showed the cabin's main room, but populated with transparent figures, men, women, and children, dressed in clothing from different time periods, all standing in a circle around the fireplace. Their faces were turned toward the viewer with expressions of desperate urgency. "Where did you see this, Marcus?" "I didn't see it," he said, confused by her reaction. "I just felt like I should draw it, like someone was telling me what to put on the paper." Maya's hands were shaking as she took the drawing for a closer look. The figures were rendered with remarkable detail for an 8-year-old's work. Individual faces, period clothing, even expressions that seemed to convey specific emotions. Fear, sadness, determination, and underneath it all, a kind of resigned acceptance. "Marcus, I need you to tell me if you see or hear anything unusual while we're here. Anything at all. Can you do that for me?" He nodded solemnly, and Maya realized she was asking an 8-year-old to be her early warning system for supernatural phenomena. The thought should have been absurd, but somehow it felt like the most sensible precaution she could take. They spent the rest of the morning cleaning, and Maya had to admit the place responded well to attention. Underneath decades of dust and neglect, the cabin showed signs of having once been beautiful. But as they worked, she kept finding things that didn't belong in any normal home. Behind the bookshelf in the main room, Maya discovered a loose floorboard that, when pried up, revealed a hidden compartment beneath. Inside was a leather-bound journal wrapped in what appeared to be oiled cloth, along with several small glass vials containing dried herbs and other substances she couldn't identify. The journal was bound with a leather cord, and when Maya untied it, the pages fell open to an entry dated September 15th, 1943, written in the same cramped handwriting she recognized from the documents they'd found yesterday. "The visitors came again last night, 3 of them this time, standing at the foot of my bed and trying to tell me something I can't understand yet. Their voices sound like wind through dry leaves, but I'm beginning to make out individual words. Protect, maintain, never let it wake. I don't know what it is yet, but I can feel something stirring beneath the cabin when they're here. Something that makes the floorboards vibrate under my feet." Maya's hands trembled. As she turned the page, September 20th, 1943, I tried to research the history of this land at the library in town, but Mrs. Patterson wouldn't let me see the old records. She said some things were better left buried, and that my family had been keeping the peace up here for longer than anyone could remember. When I pressed her for details, she just gave me this journal and told me everything I needed to know was already written down by the women who came before me. The next entry was dated a week later, September 27th, 1943. I understand now. This land sits on top of something that must never be allowed to wake fully. The visitors are the souls of previous keepers, Women from my family line who chose to stay and maintain the binding rather than abandon their responsibility. They're not haunting this place, they're helping to guard it. But the price is becoming clear. Each keeper ages faster than she should, giving years of her life to maintain whatever spiritual energy keeps the sleeper contained. Maya looked up from the journal, suddenly aware that Marcus had gone completely silent. She found him standing in the middle of the main room, head tilted as if listening to something she couldn't hear. "What is it, baby?" "The whispers are back," he said matter-of-factly. "They're saying your name, and something about the choice. They want to know if you're going to be brave enough to stay." Maya felt ice water in her veins. "Marcus, can you see who's whispering?" "Not really. They're like shadows, but shadows that move when there's no light to make them. And they're sad, Mama. Really, really sad." Maya closed the journal and stood up, decision crystallizing in her mind. Whatever was happening here, whatever her family had been involved in for generations, she needed to understand it completely before she made any permanent choices about their future. "Marcus, I want you to pack your things. We're going back to town for a few days while I do some research." But as they gathered their belongings, Maya discovered that leaving wasn't going to be as simple as she'd hoped. The car, which had run perfectly fine the day before, now refused to start. The engine turned over, but there was no spark, no sign of life from the electrical system. Tom Birch arrived an hour after Maya called the general store for help, driving a pickup truck that looked older than he was. He spent 30 minutes examining her Honda's engine before straightening up with a puzzled expression. "Strangest thing I've ever seen," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Everything looks fine mechanically, but it's like the electrical system just stopped working overnight. I can tow it back to my shop, but I have to tell you, I've seen this before with cars that spend too much time up here." "What do you mean?" Tom glanced toward the cabin, then back at Maya with an expression she was learning to recognize, the look of someone who knew more than they wanted to say. "Your great-aunt Rosalie went through 3 cars in 40 years. Same problem every time. Electrical systems would just stop working after a few months on this property. She finally gave up and learned to walk everywhere, or caught rides with folks from town when she needed supplies." Maya felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Are you saying something about this place interferes with car engines?" "I'm saying there are things in these mountains that don't like modern conveniences," Tom replied carefully. "Old-timers used to say the land itself has a preference for how things should be, and sometimes it enforces those preferences." He loaded their car onto his truck and gave them a ride back to town, but not before Maya saw him place what looked like a small bag of salt on the dashboard of his pickup. When she asked about it, he just smiled and said it was an old habit his grandfather had taught him. Martha Henderson put them up in a room above the diner, refusing to accept payment despite Maya's protests. The room was small but clean, with twin beds and a window that looked out over the main street of Cedar Hollow. For the first time in 2 days, Maya felt like she could breathe normally. That evening, after Marcus had fallen asleep, Maya walked downstairs to find Martha waiting for her in the diner's kitchen with 2 cups of coffee and a plate of homemade cookies. "I figured you'd have questions," Martha said simply. Maya sat down across from her, grateful for the first normal human interaction she'd had since arriving in Cedar Hollow. "I found Rosalie's journal. Some of what she wrote is probably true," Martha finished. "I know how it sounds, honey. If someone had told me these stories when I was your age, I'd have thought they were crazy. But I've lived in this town for 60 years, and I've seen enough to know that some places carry burdens that can't be explained by modern thinking. Tell me what you know." Martha was quiet for a long moment, stirring her coffee and gathering her thoughts. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades of carefully kept secrets. "My grandmother was friends with your great-great-grandmother, Sarah Carter. Sarah was the one who first told our family why the women in your line never seemed to live ordinary lives. According to the stories passed down through the generations, that land was sacred to the indigenous people who lived here before white settlers arrived. Not sacred in a good way, sacred in the sense that it was meant to be avoided, respected and, above all, never disturbed. Maya leaned forward, feeling pieces of an impossible puzzle beginning to fit together. When the first white family built on that land in the 1850s, they ignored the warnings. Within 6 months, they'd all either disappeared or died under strange circumstances. The same thing happened to the next family and the next. By the time your ancestors arrived in the 1880s, the local tribes had given up trying to warn people directly. Instead, they made a deal. What kind of deal? Your great-great-great-grandmother, Hannah Carter, was apparently sensitive to things most people can't perceive. The tribal elders recognized this gift and offered to teach her how to maintain the spiritual binding that kept whatever was buried beneath that land contained. In exchange, her family would be allowed to live on the property safely, but they would also be bound to it by responsibility. Maya thought about the journal entries she'd read, the pattern of single women inheriting the property, the early deaths and strange disappearances. How many generations has this been going on?
5, counting you.
Each keeper has found her own way to manage the responsibility, but they've all made the same basic choice: stay and protect the world from something that should never be allowed to wake up, or abandon the land and let whatever's down there eventually break free. Maya felt the weight of inherited responsibility settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. What happens if it wakes up? Martha's expression grew grave. According to the old stories, the last time it stirred significantly was in 1918. That's when the Spanish flu hit this region particularly hard, killing nearly a third of the population in some areas. The tribal elders said the sickness was just a side effect of the sleepers' restlessness. Maya spent the next hour learning about a hidden history that no school had ever taught. A world where spiritual responsibilities were passed down through bloodlines, and the price of protecting others was measured in years of your own life. It sounded like fantasy, like the kind of stories people made up to explain natural disasters and unexplained deaths. But Maya had heard the whispers. She'd seen Marcus's drawings and felt the wrongness that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath the cabin. She'd watched her car's electrical system fail overnight and noticed how even the birds avoided flying over their property. Most convincingly, she'd felt the pull herself, a growing certainty that leaving Cedar Hollow would be more difficult than simply packing up and driving away, as if the land itself had already begun to claim her. What happened to the keepers who tried to leave? Maya asked. Martha's expression was answer enough, but she spoke the words anyway. They died, honey, usually within a few months from accidents or illnesses that seemed natural enough on the surface, but always struck people who knew the family as too convenient, too perfectly timed. Maya looked toward the stairs that led to the room where Marcus slept peacefully, unaware that his entire future might already be decided by choices made generations before his birth, and their children. Some inherited the responsibility when they came of age. Others managed to break free by rejecting the inheritance entirely, leaving the area and never coming back. But there's always been at least one keeper from your family line maintaining the binding. Until now, Maya understood the implication. If she chose to abandon the property and take Marcus away, she would be breaking a chain of responsibility that had protected not just Cedar Hollow, but potentially a much larger area. For over a century, I need to see everything, Maya said finally. All the records, all the stories, everything anyone knows about what my family has been dealing with. If I'm going to make this choice, I need to understand exactly what I'm choosing. Martha nodded as if she'd been expecting this response. I'll arrange for you to meet with some people tomorrow. But Maya, once you know everything, there's no going back to ignorance. Sometimes not knowing is the only thing that allows people to walk away. Maya spent that night lying awake in the small bed above the diner, listening to Marcus breathe steadily in the bed next to hers, and trying to imagine a future where they could simply return to their old life in the city, where supernatural responsibilities were someone else's problem, and the most dangerous thing she had to worry about was paying rent on time. But even as she tried to envision that escape, she could feel something pulling at her consciousness, a connection that had been forged the moment she'd stepped across the threshold of Rosalie's cabin, a bond that grew stronger with each hour she spent in Cedar Hollow. By morning, Maya had accepted what she'd probably known since finding Rosalie's journal. She was going to stay. The only question now was whether she could find a way to protect Marcus from inheriting the same burden, or if she was simply the next link in a chain that stretched back generations and would continue long after she was gone. The learning would begin in earnest today, but Maya suspected the real education had started the moment she'd heard whispers calling her name from within the walls of a cabin that had been waiting for her arrival far longer than she'd ever imagined. The education Maya received over the next 3 days changed her understanding of the world forever. Martha introduced her to Dr. Morrison, who had not only been great-aunt Rosalie's physician, but had also served as an unofficial record-keeper for the supernatural events that periodically affected Cedar Hollow. His medical files, kept in a locked cabinet separate from his regular patient records, documented decades of unusual incidents, clusters of unexplained illnesses that coincided with periods when the keeper had been away from the property, animal behavior anomalies that seemed to radiate outward from the Carterland, and a pattern of early deaths among Maya's family members that couldn't be attributed to genetics alone. Your great-aunt aged approximately 2 years for every year she spent as keeper, Dr. Morrison explained, as he showed Maya photographs documenting Rosalie's physical decline. When she inherited the property at 20, she looked like any healthy young woman. By 40, she appeared to be 60. It wasn't disease in any medical sense I could identify. It was as if her life force was being gradually drained to power something else. Maya studied the photographs with growing dread. The progression was undeniable, from vibrant young woman to prematurely aged guardian in the span of 2 decades. But it was the discovery of hand-carved wooden symbols hidden throughout the cabin's structure that truly opened her eyes to what her family had been dealing with. Tom Birch arrived that afternoon to help with some basic repairs, and Maya was surprised when he immediately recognized the symbols she'd found carved into the support beams. "Protection marks," he said matter-of-factly. "My grandfather used to carve similar ones, said they helped keep bad spirits from settling into a place." "Your grandfather knew about—" Maya gestured vaguely toward the cabin. Tom nodded, his expression growing serious. "3 generations of my family have done work on this property. We've seen things that can't be explained, heard stories that sound crazy until you spend a night up here alone. My grandfather always said your family was carrying a burden that kept the rest of us safe, even if we didn't understand what that meant." He showed Maya how to identify the different protective symbols, some carved into wooden beams, others etched into stone foundations, all placed with careful intention to create a network of spiritual barriers around the cabin. "Rosalie had me add new ones every few years," Tom explained. "Said the old ones wore out over time, needed refreshing. She taught me the proper way to carve them, what words to say while I worked. Felt foolish at first, but after what I've seen up here, I'm not taking any chances." Maya began to understand that her great-aunt hadn't been working alone. There was an entire informal network of people in Cedar Hollow who knew at least part of the truth and had been quietly supporting the keeper for decades. Over dinner that evening at Martha's diner, Maya met some of these allies. Carl Brennan from the gas station admitted that he'd been keeping detailed records of unusual animal behavior in the area, noting patterns that seemed to correlate with the keeper's emotional state and the strength of whatever binding held the sleeper in check. "Animals know things we don't," Carl explained. When Rosalie was having a particularly difficult time maintaining her responsibilities, you could see it in how the wildlife behaved. Birds would avoid the area entirely, deer would change their migration routes. Even the insects would seem agitated. June Brennan, Carl's wife, revealed that she'd been quietly providing herbs and other supplies that Rosalie needed for her rituals. "She taught me which plants had protective properties, where to gather them during certain moon phases. I've got a whole garden behind our house dedicated to things most people would consider weeds. Maya realized that accepting the role of keeper didn't mean facing the responsibility entirely alone. Her family had built relationships over the generations, creating a support system that could help share the burden in ways that weren't immediately obvious. But it was Marcus's reaction to these revelations that troubled Maya most. Her son had been unusually quiet during the adult conversations, but she could see him processing everything with the serious attention he brought to understanding complex drawings. That night, as they prepared for bed in the room above the diner, Marcus finally spoke up. "Mama, are we going to be like Great-Aunt Rosalie? Are we going to get old too fast because of the sad thing under the cabin?" Maya sat down on the edge of his bed, struggling to find words that would be honest without being terrifying. "I don't know yet, baby, but I'm learning about ways to make it easier, ways to share the responsibility so it doesn't hurt us as much. The Whisper people want to help," Marcus said matter-of-factly. "They told me they've been waiting for someone who was smart enough to listen to them instead of trying to do everything alone." Maya felt a chill. "What else do the Whisper people tell you?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ceiling as if listening to voices she couldn't hear. "They say Great-Aunt Rosalie was too scared to trust them completely. She thought accepting help from dead people was wrong, so she tried to carry all the heavy feelings by herself. But they want to share the work if we'll let them." That night, Maya made her first truly informed decision about their future. She would return to the cabin, but she would do so with full knowledge of what she was accepting and a plan for approaching the responsibility differently than her great-aunt had. The next morning, she enrolled Marcus in Cedar Hollow Elementary School. The decision surprised everyone, including Maya herself. But as she filled out the enrollment paperwork in the small school office, she realized she was making a statement about permanence, about choosing to build a life in this place rather than simply enduring their circumstances. Marcus seemed to understand the significance as well. When Maya told him they were staying in Cedar Hollow, his expression showed relief rather than fear. "I like it here," he said simply. "The Whisper people are sad, but they're not mean, and I think they've been lonely for a really long time." Maya's first week of work at Dr. Morrison's clinic revealed another aspect of the keeper's role that no one had explicitly explained. Several patients seemed to respond to her presence in ways that went beyond normal medical care. Elderly people with chronic pain reported feeling better after Maya examined them. Anxious patients became calmer during their appointments. And even Dr. Morrison commented on how quickly people seemed to heal when Maya was involved in their treatment. Rosalie had the same effect on people, Dr. Morrison explained when Maya asked about it. Keepers develop a kind of healing energy that comes from being connected to both the physical and spiritual worlds. It's one of the compensations for the burden you carry. You become a conduit for positive energy as well as a guardian against negative forces. Maya began to see her role, not just as a supernatural responsibility, but as a calling that could bring genuine benefit to the community she was choosing to join. But it was the discovery of Rosalie's correspondence with other keeper families that truly changed Maya's understanding of her situation. Hidden in a trunk in the cabin's loft, Maya found dozens of letters dating back decades, exchanges between her great-aunt and people in other parts of the country who maintained similar responsibilities. There were keepers in Louisiana who guarded against entities that rose from ancient swampland, families in New Mexico who maintained bindings over sites where indigenous sacred objects had been desecrated, and even urban keepers who dealt with spiritual contamination in places where great tragedies had occurred. The letters revealed a hidden network of people who understood the reality of supernatural responsibilities, who shared techniques and provided emotional support for burdens that couldn't be discussed with ordinary folks. Most importantly, they contained detailed discussions of methods for reducing the physical cost of serving as a keeper. The key is learning to work with the ancestor spirits, rather than trying to shoulder everything. Alone, wrote a woman named Catherine Moreau from New Orleans. I spent my first 10 years as keeper aging rapidly because I was afraid to trust the dead. But once I learned to accept their help, the burden became manageable. I'm now 57 but look perhaps 45. And I expect to live a reasonably normal lifespan while still maintaining my responsibilities. Masha spent that evening reading through dozens of similar accounts, learning about techniques that Rosalie had either never discovered or never been willing to try. The common theme was collaboration. Keepers who thrived were those who learned to work with spirits, communities, and even other keeper families, rather than treating their role as a solitary burden. As she read, Maya became aware of presences gathering around her, the same whispers that had been calling her name since her first night in the cabin, but clearer now, more distinct. She could sense individual personalities, different voices trying to communicate specific information. "We tried to teach Rosalie," said a voice that seemed to come from an elderly woman, "but she was frightened of us, thought we were demons trying to corrupt her. She never understood that we remained earthbound by choice, to help protect the living." Maya looked up from the letters, addressing the empty air but somehow knowing her words would be heard. "I want to learn. I want to understand how to work with you instead of fighting alone." The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, and Maya saw movement in her peripheral vision, shadows that seemed to have substance, shapes that suggested human forms without quite becoming visible. "First, you must see the chamber beneath the cabin," the voice continued. "That is where the real work happens, where the binding must be maintained each day." Rosalie performed the rituals, but she never truly understood what she was channeling her energy into. Maya felt a mixture of anticipation and fear. She was being invited deeper into mysteries that her great-aunt had spent 40 years exploring. But she was also being offered guidance that Rosalie had apparently rejected. "Show me," Maya said aloud. The shadows in the room seemed to shift and solidify, and for the first time since arriving at the cabin, Maya saw the ancestor spirits clearly, translucent figures wearing clothing from different historical periods, all watching her with expressions of cautious hope. At their head stood a young black woman who looked remarkably like Maya herself, but dressed in the style of the 1880s. "I am Hannah Carter," the woman said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "I was the first keeper, the one who agreed to bind our family to this responsibility. I have been waiting over a century for someone who would be strong, enough to accept help rather than trying to carry everything." Alone, Maya understood that she was being offered something Rosalie had never accepted: true partnership with the spirits who had maintained the binding for generations, a sharing of responsibility that could reduce the physical cost while strengthening the spiritual protection. "What do I need to do?" Maya asked. Hannah smiled, and for the first time since arriving at the cabin, Maya felt genuinely hopeful about their future. "Learn to trust," Hannah said simply. "Learn to share. And most importantly, learn to heal rather than simply contain. The binding has grown weaker over the generations because we have been treating symptoms rather than addressing the original wound. But with your medical knowledge and Marcus's sensitivity to the spiritual realm, we might finally be able to do more than just hold back the darkness." Maya went to sleep that night with the understanding that she was no longer just inheriting a burden. She was being invited to help solve a problem that had plagued her family for over a century. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. But for the first time since finding Rosalie's diary, Maya felt like she might be able to protect Marcus while still fulfilling her responsibilities. The real work was about to begin. The education began immediately, but not in ways Maya had expected. The morning after her first clear conversation with Hannah, Maya woke to find Marcus sitting at the kitchen table with his sketchbook, working on a drawing that made her breath catch in her throat. The image showed the cabin's main room, but with the floorboards removed to reveal a circular stone chamber beneath. Figures in period clothing stood around the chamber's perimeter, their hands joined in what appeared to be a protective ritual. They showed me where the important room is, Marcus said without looking up from his work. The Whisper people want us to see it today, but they say we have to be very respectful because that's where the really old sadness lives. Maya studied the drawing, recognizing some of the figures from the previous night's encounter with Hannah and the other ancestor spirits. But there were details in Marcus's sketch that troubled her. Symbols carved into the chamber walls that looked far more complex than the simple protective marks she'd found throughout the cabin, and what appeared to be stains on the stone floor that could have been anything from rust to something far more disturbing. After breakfast, Maya began the systematic exploration of the cabin that Hannah had recommended. Working methodically from room to room, she looked for anything that might indicate access to a hidden chamber. It was Marcus who found it, following guidance that seemed to come from voices only he could hear clearly. "Here, Mama," he said, kneeling beside a section of kitchen floorboards that looked identical to all the others. "They say if you press on this part and that part at the same time." Maya followed his directions, applying pressure to two specific boards simultaneously. With a soft click, a section of the floor shifted slightly, revealing that what appeared to be solid planking was actually a carefully concealed trapdoor. The chamber beneath was exactly as Marcus had drawn it, circular, with walls made of fitted stones that predated the cabin by centuries, and a ceiling low enough that Maya had to duck slightly to stand upright. But it was the newspaper clipping pinned to one of the stone walls that made Maya's hands shake as she held her flashlight steady. The yellowed paper was from the Cedar Hollow Gazette, dated August 15th, 1967, with a headline that read, "Local family disappears without trace." The article described the Hendricks family, Robert, age 45, his wife Susan, 42, and their 3 children, who had rented the Carter cabin for what was supposed to be a month-long vacation. Maya read the article with growing horror, recognizing the pattern that Martha Henderson had tried to warn her about. The Hendricks had arrived with high hopes for a peaceful mountain retreat. Neighbors had seen lights in the cabin for the first week, then nothing. When Rosalie finally investigated, she found meals half-eaten on the table and personal belongings still neatly arranged in the bedrooms. But no sign of the family anywhere. The article mentioned that the family's car was found a week later, abandoned on a logging road 15 miles away, with no indication of where they might have gone or why they would have left everything behind. Local authorities had conducted an extensive search, but no trace of the 5 family members was ever discovered. But it was the handwritten note attached to the clipping that made Maya sink onto the chamber's stone steps in shock. In Rosalie's distinctive handwriting, the binding failed while I was in the hospital recovering from pneumonia. I was away for 3 weeks, and the sleeper's influence spread beyond the property boundaries. The Hendricks family was consumed, not killed but absorbed. Their life force used to strengthen the entity I was supposed to be containing. This must never happen again. Maya understood now why the townspeople had looked at her with such a mixture of sympathy and wariness. They knew that families who came to the Carter cabin sometimes simply vanished, and they suspected that those disappearances were connected to whatever supernatural forces her family was supposed to be managing. "Maya." Hannah's voice came from directly behind her, and Maya turned to see the ancestor spirit standing at the bottom of the stone steps, her translucent form more solid-looking in the chamber than it had been upstairs. "Tell me about the Hendricks family," Maya said quietly. Hannah's expression was sorrowful. "Rosalie became ill during the summer of 1967. The pneumonia nearly killed her, and she spent weeks in the hospital in the county seat. We tried to maintain the binding without her, but we are spirits. We needed a living conduit to channel enough energy to keep the sleeper contained." "What happened to them?" "The entity broke free from the deepest bindings and began feeding on any life force it could reach. The Hendricks family was staying directly above its prison. They were consumed gradually over the course of several days. Not a violent death, but a draining away of everything that made them alive. By the time Rosalie returned, there was nothing left to save." Maya felt sick. How many others? Over the generations? Perhaps a dozen families, most during periods when the keeper was unable to maintain daily rituals due to illness or absence. Each failure taught us more about how the binding works and what happens when it weakens. But the cost in lives was terrible. Maya spent the next hour exploring the chamber, while Hannah and other ancestor spirits provided commentary on what she was seeing. The carved symbols on the walls were indeed far more complex than the simple protective marks throughout the cabin. These were elements of the original binding ceremony, created by indigenous shamans working in cooperation with the first spirits to volunteer for earthbound service. The chamber serves as a focal point, Hannah explained. The daily rituals performed here reinforce the spiritual barriers that keep the sleeper contained. But the energy required increases over time, as the entity grows stronger from feeding on the ambient life force that exists in any area where people live and work. Maya found evidence of how the binding had evolved over the generations, newer symbols carved alongside older ones, modifications to the ritual space that reflected different keepers' approaches to the responsibility. But she also found signs of the physical toll the work had taken on her family members. Built into alcoves around the chamber were what appeared to be memorial niches, each containing personal items from a previous keeper. Maya found Hannah's wedding ring, her great-great-grandmother's medical supplies from when she'd served as the area's unofficial nurse, and most recently, reading glasses that must have belonged to Rosalie. Each keeper contributed something of herself to strengthening the binding, Hannah explained. Not just life energy, but personal possessions that held emotional significance. The chamber remembers everyone who has served, and their memories become part of the protection. Maya was beginning to understand the true scope of what she'd inherited. This wasn't just a supernatural responsibility, passed down through the generations. It was a living history of women who had sacrificed normal lives to protect others from a threat most people would never know existed. But it was Marcus who asked the question that changed everything. Hannah, he said, apparently addressing empty air, but somehow knowing exactly where the spirit was standing. Why doesn't the sad thing under the ground just go away? What's keeping it here? The ancestor spirits exchanged glances that Maya could actually see now, as if her time in the chamber was strengthening her ability to perceive them clearly. The entity remains because the original wound that created it has never healed, Hannah said slowly. We have spent over a century containing the symptoms rather than addressing the cause. But the binding grows weaker each generation because we are treating it as a problem to be managed rather than an injury to be cured. Maya felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. What kind of wound? A great betrayal occurred on this land long before white settlers arrived. Sacred trust was broken, innocents were murdered, and their blood soaked into earth that was meant to be kept pure. The trauma created a tear in the spiritual fabric of the place, and through that tear, the entity began seeping in from elsewhere. Maya's medical training provided a framework for understanding what Hannah was describing. So the sleeper isn't the original problem. It's like an infection that got into a wound that was never properly cleaned and allowed to heal. Exactly. And like any infection, it will continue to grow stronger until the underlying injury is addressed. Maya spent the rest of that day learning about failed attempts over the generations to heal the original wound rather than simply containing its effects. Each keeper had tried different approaches: prayer, purification rituals, even attempts to communicate directly with the spirits of the original victims, but none had succeeded in creating lasting change. The problem, Hannah explained, is that healing requires forgiveness, and the spirits of those who were betrayed have never been able to move past their anger and pain. They remain earthbound, not just to help maintain the binding, but because they cannot release their attachment to the injustice they suffered that evening. As Maya and Marcus prepared dinner in the cabin's kitchen, Maya found herself thinking about her work at Dr. Morrison's clinic. She'd seen how physical wounds festered when foreign matter was trapped inside, how infections persisted until the underlying damage was properly addressed. But she'd also seen how even severe injuries could heal completely when given the right conditions and care. "Marcus," she said as they sat down to eat, "do you think the Whisper people would be willing to try something different? Instead of just holding back the sad thing, what if we tried to help it feel better?" Marcus considered this with the seriousness he brought to all important questions. "I think they're tired, Mama. They've been holding on to hurt feelings for a really long time, and it's making them heavy. But they're scared that if they let go, the bad thing will get loose and hurt other people." Maya nodded, understanding beginning to crystallize in her mind. The ancestor spirits were trapped in a cycle of spiritual trauma, unable to heal, because they believed their constant vigilance was all that stood between the world and disaster. But their very inability to heal was what kept the binding from becoming permanent and self-sustaining. "What if we could show them another way?" Maya said, speaking as much to the empty air around them as to Marcus. "What if we could prove that healing doesn't mean abandoning responsibility?" The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, and Maya sensed the familiar presence of the ancestor spirits gathering around their table. But this time, instead of whispers and half-glimpsed shadows, she could see them clearly, dozens of figures representing over a century of keepers and the original spirits who had chosen to help them. "You are proposing something that has never been attempted," Hannah said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "To heal the original wound would require the spirits of the betrayed to release their anger and accept peace. But if they move on to whatever comes after death, who will help maintain the binding?" "Maybe," Maya said carefully, "the binding wouldn't need to be maintained by people anymore. Maybe if the wound heals properly, the land itself will remember how to stay healthy." The ancestor spirits fell silent, and Maya could sense them conferring in ways that transcended spoken language. Finally, Hannah spoke again. "What you suggest is possible, but it would require perfect cooperation between the living and the dead, and the ceremony would be dangerous. If we attempt to heal the wound but fail, the sleeper could break free entirely during the process." Maya looked at Marcus, who was listening to the conversation with the calm attention he might give to a discussion of household chores. Her son had grown up with supernatural experiences as simply another part of life, and his lack of fear was helping Maya approach this enormous responsibility with practical determination rather than paralyzing terror. "How long do we have to prepare?" Maya asked. "The binding is stable for now, but it weakens each time the keeper changes," Hannah replied. "You have perhaps a year before the entity becomes strong enough to test the barriers seriously. If you are going to attempt a healing ceremony, it should happen before then." Maya spent that night reading through Rosalie's correspondence with other keeper families, looking for any mention of similar attempts at permanent solutions. She found references to a family in Louisiana who had successfully transformed their binding into something that no longer required human guardians, and detailed notes about techniques that might be adapted for different types of spiritual wounds. But she also found warnings about the risks involved. In such ceremonies, accounts of keepers who had attempted to heal rather than contain, only to die when their spiritual energy was completely drained by the effort. As Maya finally prepared for sleep, she realized that she was no longer just accepting an inherited responsibility. She was being asked to. Maya's research into the possibility of a healing ceremony led her to discoveries that changed her understanding of both her family's history and her own capabilities. The breakthrough came when she found a bundle of letters hidden behind loose stones in the chamber's wall, correspondence between Rosalie and a Catholic priest named Father Miguel Santos, dating from the 1950s through the 1980s. The letters revealed that Rosalie had spent decades trying to understand the spiritual dimensions of her responsibility, consulting with religious leaders from multiple traditions in her search for alternatives to the endless cycle of containment. Father Santos had been particularly helpful, sharing knowledge from his work with indigenous communities in New Mexico who dealt with similar spiritual contamination from sites where sacred objects had been desecrated or burial grounds disturbed. His letters described successful healing ceremonies that had transformed malevolent spiritual presences into protective forces. But he consistently warned that such work required participants who were willing to risk everything for the possibility of permanent peace. The process you describe, Father Santos had written in 1978, is essentially spiritual surgery, performed on a wound that extends across multiple dimensions of existence. Like any surgery, it can be curative if done properly, but it can also be fatal if the practitioner lacks the necessary skill or spiritual strength. Maya found detailed instructions for what Father Santos called a reconciliation ceremony, a ritual designed to help earthbound spirits release their attachment to trauma and move peacefully into whatever came after death. But the ceremony required more than just knowledge of proper techniques. It needed someone who could serve as a conduit for massive amounts of spiritual energy while maintaining the focus necessary to guide the process to completion. The ideal practitioner, according to Father Santos's notes, would combine medical training with psychic sensitivity, analytical thinking with spiritual openness. They would need to understand both the mechanics of healing and the psychology of forgiveness. Maya realized she was reading a description of qualifications she actually possessed. Her nursing background provided the medical framework for understanding healing processes. Her growing ability to communicate with spirits gave her the necessary psychic sensitivity, and her analytical approach to problem-solving might allow her to manage the complex logistics of such a ceremony. But it was Marcus's reaction to these discoveries that convinced Maya she was on the right path. Her son had been spending increasing amounts of time in conversations with spirits only he could see clearly, and his drawings had begun showing scenes that depicted not just the current state of the spiritual realm around their cabin, but possible futures that might result from different choices. The Whisper people are excited, Marcus told her one evening as he worked on a particularly detailed sketch. They've been waiting so long for someone to think about making the sad feelings better instead of just keeping them locked up. Maya looked at his latest drawing and saw something that made her heart race with possibility. The image showed the chamber beneath the cabin, but instead of the grim memorial space she'd come to know, Marcus had drawn it filled with light. Spirits that had appeared translucent and mournful in his previous work now seemed solid and peaceful, and the symbols on the walls glowed as if infused with positive energy. This is what could happen if the healing works, Maya asked. Marcus nodded seriously. Hannah showed me. She says if they can let go of the hurt feelings, the bad thing underneath won't be able to eat people anymore. The ground itself will remember how to keep it sleeping, so nobody will have to stay here forever just to watch it. Maya spent the next several weeks learning everything she could about the spiritual mechanics of trauma and forgiveness. She corresponded with scholars who studied comparative religion, consulted with Eleanor Crow Feather about indigenous healing practices, and even reached out to the keeper families in Louisiana whose letters Rosalie had saved. The response from Catherine Moreau in New Orleans was particularly encouraging. What you describe is exactly what we accomplished here in 1987. Our entity was different, a collective spiritual wound created by centuries of slavery and violence, but the principle was the same. We discovered that the malevolent presence wasn't inherently evil, just eternally angry and in pain. Once we helped the associated spirits find peace and forgiveness, the negative energy transformed into something protective rather than destructive. Catherine's letter included detailed instructions for preparing both the living and the dead for a reconciliation ceremony, along with warnings about the physical and emotional toll such work could take on the primary practitioner. I was bedridden for 3 months afterward, Catherine wrote, and I aged approximately 5 years during the single night when we performed the ceremony. But that was a small price to pay for permanent resolution. My daughter is now 35 and has never felt the call to become a keeper herself. Because there's nothing left here that requires active management, Maya began preparing for what she was starting to think of as the most important medical procedure of her career, except that her patient would be the spiritual health of the land itself, and her surgical instruments would be centuries-old ritual techniques combined with modern psychological understanding of trauma recovery. The first step was learning to work more effectively with the ancestor spirits, developing her ability to serve as a conduit for their energy while maintaining enough personal strength to guide the overall process. Hannah and the other spirits were eager to help, having waited over a century for someone willing to attempt a permanent solution. Maya's daily routine evolved to include extended meditation sessions in the chamber, during which she practiced channeling increasing amounts of spiritual energy without losing consciousness or physical stability. The work was exhausting, but she could feel her abilities growing stronger with each session. More importantly, she began to understand the individual personalities and concerns of the spirits she would be working with. Some were members of her own family line, women who had served as keepers and chosen to remain earthbound to help their successors. But others were the original, victims whose trauma had created the spiritual wound in the first place, indigenous people who had been betrayed and murdered by the first white settlers to claim their sacred land. The healing will only work if both groups can forgive, Hannah explained during one of their evening conversations. We keepers must forgive ourselves for the burden we've carried and our ancestors for the choices that created this situation. But more importantly, the original victims must find the strength to forgive their betrayers and release their attachment to justice that can never be achieved in the physical world. Maya understood that she was essentially being asked to serve as a therapist for a group therapy session involving people who had been dead for over a century. The thought should have been absurd, but her experience working with trauma patients at the hospital provided a framework for understanding what would be required. Forgiveness isn't about excusing what happened, Maya said during one of her meditation sessions, addressing the gathered spirits directly. It's about refusing to let old pain continue creating new suffering. You've been carrying this hurt for generations, and it's become a poison that affects everyone who comes near this place. The response she received wasn't in words, but in a wave of emotion that nearly knocked her unconscious. Decades of accumulated rage, grief, and despair from people who had died violently and unjustly, who had remained earthbound specifically to prevent others from suffering the same fate. But underneath the pain, Maya sensed something else: exhaustion, and a deep longing for rest that these spirits had been denying themselves for over a century. It was Marcus who provided the key insight that made Maya believe the ceremony might actually succeed. They're scared that if they stop being angry, people will forget what happened to them, he said one evening after spending the afternoon drawing pictures that only he could see clearly. They think being mad is the only way to make sure the bad people don't win. Maya realized that the spirit's attachment to trauma wasn't just about personal pain. It was about bearing witness, ensuring that the injustices they'd suffered wouldn't be forgotten or repeated. They'd chosen to remain earthbound, not just to maintain the binding, but to serve as eternal reminders of what happened when greed and prejudice overcome basic humanity. What if we could help them understand that healing doesn't mean forgetting? Maya asked during her next conversation with Hannah. What if the ceremony included a way to honor their memory and preserve their story, while still allowing them to find peace? Hannah's response was immediate and electric, literally. As the lights flickered throughout the cabin and the temperature dropped noticeably, that might actually work, Hannah said, her voice carrying more hope than Maya had ever heard from any of the spirits. If we could ensure that their sacrifice is remembered and their story preserved, they might be willing to release their attachment to earthbound. Existence. Maya spent the next week designing what she thought of as a memorial component for the healing ceremony, a way to permanently embed the spirit's stories into the spiritual fabric of the land itself, so that future generations would understand the history of the place and the price that had been paid to keep it safe. The plan was ambitious and complex, requiring precise coordination between multiple groups of spirits, specific ritual components that would need to be gathered from sacred sites across several states, and timing that would align with both lunar cycles and the anniversary of the original trauma. But for the first time since discovering Rosalie's diary, Maya felt genuinely hopeful about the future. If the ceremony succeeded, Marcus would grow up free from the burden that had claimed so many generations of their family. The land would become a place of healing rather than containment, and the spirits who had sacrificed their eternal rest to protect others could finally find the peace they deserved. The preparation would take months, but Maya was beginning to believe that she could actually solve a problem that had haunted her family for over a century. The work ahead would be the most challenging thing she'd ever attempted, but it would also be the most meaningful, a chance to transform inherited trauma into lasting healing, not just for her own family, but for everyone whose lives had been affected by the spiritual wound that had festered beneath their land for far too long. The discovery that changed everything came when Maya found Rosalie's final will and testament, hidden not in any lawyer's office, but sealed in a metal box buried beneath the cabin's back porch. Marcus led her to it, following directions from spirits who had apparently been waiting for the right moment to reveal this final piece of the puzzle. The document was more than just a legal will. It was a complete confession of everything Rosalie had learned about their family's true purpose and the nature of the inheritance she was passing. On the cabin and land are not gifts, Rosalie had written in her careful handwriting. They are a prison sentence disguised as property inheritance. Each generation of women in our family has been chosen not for our strength or wisdom, but for our capacity to serve as living feeding tubes for an entity that grows stronger with each passing decade. Maya's hands shook as she read the implications of what her great-aunt had discovered. The sleeper doesn't just feed on ambient life force. It feeds specifically on the life energy of its keepers. We are not guardians maintaining a binding. We are sacrificial offerings, renewed each generation to provide a steady source of the spiritual nutrition it requires to remain dormant, rather than actively hunting for sustenance. The document went on to explain that the entire mythology around keeping the world safe was a sophisticated form of spiritual manipulation, designed to ensure that family members would willingly accept what amounted to slow-motion human sacrifice. The entity is intelligent and patient, Rosalie continued. It has spent centuries perfecting a system that provides it with willing victims who believe they are heroes. Each keeper is consumed gradually, aging rapidly as her life force is drained, dying young, but convinced that her sacrifice serves a greater good. Maya felt sick as she read about the true fate of the ancestor spirits she had been learning to trust. According to Rosalie's research, they weren't earthbound by choice. They were trapped, their spiritual essence bound to the entity they thought they were containing, unable to move on because they had become part of its feeding system. The voices that speak to each new keeper are not the souls of previous guardians, Rosalie wrote. They are psychic echoes created by the entity itself, designed to provide just enough guidance to help each keeper accept her role, while ensuring she never discovers the truth until it is too late to escape. Maya dropped the document and ran upstairs, where she found Marcus sitting calmly at the kitchen table, working on a drawing that showed the chamber beneath the cabin in perfect detail, including elements Maya had never mentioned to him. "Marcus, how do you know what the underground room looks like?" "The Whisper people showed me," he said without looking up from his work. "But Mama, they're not the same as they were before. Something's changing about them." Maya looked at his drawing and saw what he meant. The figures surrounding the chamber no longer appeared translucent and mournful. They looked solid, substantial, and their expressions were not sad but hungry. The symbols on the chamber walls were glowing, but the light seemed predatory rather than protective. "Marcus, I need you to listen to me very carefully. The Whisper people are not what we thought they were. They're dangerous, and we need to leave this place immediately." But even as Maya spoke the words, she realized that leaving might no longer be an option. Over the months they'd been living at the cabin, she'd felt an increasingly strong attachment to the land, not just emotional but physical, as if her very life force had become rooted in the soil beneath their home. Marcus looked up from his drawing with an expression that was far too knowing for an 8-year-old. "We can't leave, Mama. You know that, don't you? The moment you decided to stay, the moment you started working with the Whisper people, you became part of the feeding system. We both did." Maya's blood turned to ice water as she realized that Marcus was right. The pull she felt to remain at the cabin wasn't protectiveness or a sense of responsibility. It was spiritual bondage, a supernatural addiction that made abandoning her role as keeper physically and emotionally impossible. She thought about Tom Birch, who had been helping with repairs around the cabin for months, and who had mentioned that his family had been supporting the keepers for generations. She thought about Dr. Morrison's casual comment that keepers developed healing abilities, and Martha Henderson's detailed knowledge of herbs that Rosalie had needed for her rituals. The entire community of Cedar Hollow wasn't just aware of the supernatural situation, they were complicit in it. They helped each new keeper settle into her role because they benefited from having the entity well-fed and dormant. A hungry sleeper might expand its hunting territory to include the town itself, but a properly maintained keeper system kept the threat contained to a single family line. Maya ran to the chamber beneath the cabin, hoping to find some evidence that would contradict Rosalie's final testament. Instead, she found proof that her great-aunt's discoveries had been accurate. The memorial niches she'd thought contained tributes to previous keepers actually held feeding vessels, physical objects that served as conduits for transferring life energy from keeper to entity. The carved symbols on the walls weren't protective barriers, but spiritual circuitry designed to channel and concentrate the feeding process, most damning of all. She found Rosalie's journal entries from her final months, written in a hand that grew increasingly shaky as her strength failed. "I understand now that there is no escape, no heroic purpose, no greater good being served. I am cattle, bred and raised to be consumed by a parasite that has perfected the art of making its victims complicit in their own destruction. The only choice left to me is whether to warn Maya or allow her to discover the truth as I did. Too late to change anything, but not too late to suffer with full knowledge of what is happening." Maya sank to the stone floor of the chamber, overwhelmed by the scope of the deception that had shaped her family's history for over a century. Every choice she'd made since arriving at the cabin, staying despite the warnings, learning to work with the spirits, preparing for a healing ceremony, had been guided by an entity that wanted exactly what she was providing: willing cooperation in her own consumption. But it was Marcus who provided the insight that transformed despair into determination. "Mama," he said from the top of the chamber stairs, "the Whisper people are scared." Maya looked up at her son, who was still holding his sketchbook, but now appeared to be listening to voices she couldn't hear. "What are they saying?" "They're not really the Whisper people anymore," Marcus said matter-of-factly. "They're just echoes, like voices bouncing around in an empty room. But the real people, the ones who got eaten by the bad thing, they're still down there somewhere. And they're angry." Maya felt a flicker of hope pierce through her despair. "What do you mean?" Marcus climbed down into the chamber and sat beside her, opening his sketchbook to a page she hadn't seen before. The drawing showed the same underground space, but now there were two distinct groups of figures, the translucent, hungry-looking entities that had been guiding her, and a separate group that appeared to be trapped behind some kind of spiritual barrier. The real Whisper people are the ones who figured out what was happening and tried to warn the new keepers, Marcus explained. But the bad thing caught them and locked them up so they couldn't spoil its feeding system. The fake Whisper people are the ones who help trick each new keeper into cooperating. Maya studied the drawing, beginning to understand the true complexity of what they were dealing with. The entity wasn't just a mindless parasite. It was sophisticated enough to maintain multiple levels of deception, even creating false spiritual advisors to guide each keeper through the process of accepting her fate. But if there were genuine spirits trapped within the entity's feeding system, people who had discovered the truth and tried to resist, then Maya might not be the first keeper to recognize the deception. There might be allies available, spiritual resistance fighters who could help her find a way to break the cycle. "Can you talk to the real Whisper people?" Maya asked Marcus. "Maybe, but the bad thing doesn't want me to, so it's really hard. Like trying to hear someone whispering when there's loud music playing." Maya made a decision that would determine whether they became the next victims in a century-long pattern of spiritual predation, or the generation that finally broke free from a system designed to ensure their compliance in their own destruction. "Marcus, I need you to help me contact the real spirits, the ones who are trapped. If they've been fighting this thing from the inside, they might know something that could help us escape." But even as Maya spoke the words, she felt the spiritual bonds that connected her to the land tightening around her consciousness like invisible chains. The entity had invested months in preparing her as its next meal, and it would not allow her to simply walk away now that she understood what was really happening. The fake Hannah appeared at the bottom of the chamber stairs, her form more solid and threatening than Maya had ever seen before. "You have learned things that will only cause you suffering," the false spirit said, her voice carrying an authority that made Maya's bones ache. "Accept your role with grace as your predecessors did. Fight against your purpose, and we will be forced to take what we need more directly." Maya understood the threat. If she refused to serve willingly as a keeper, providing her life energy gradually through daily rituals, the entity would simply drain her completely in a matter of days. Then move on to Marcus as the next available family member, but surrender meant condemning her son to the same fate she was facing, a lifetime of spiritual servitude culminating in premature death, all while believing he was serving some noble purpose. Maya looked at Marcus, who was watching the confrontation with the calm attention he brought to everything supernatural, and made the most important decision of her life. "Show me how to contact the real spirits," she said quietly. "If we're going to fight this thing, we need all the help we can get." The false Hannah's expression shifted from authoritative to genuinely threatening, and the temperature in the chamber dropped so rapidly that Maya could see her breath forming clouds in the suddenly frigid air. "You will regret this choice," the entity said through its spiritual puppet. "But you will not regret it for long." Maya wrapped her arms around Marcus and realized that the real battle for their freedom was about to begin, not against some abstract evil, but against a sophisticated predator that had been perfecting its hunting techniques for over a century. The question was whether two people, one of them a child, could succeed where 5 generations of keepers had failed, or if they were simply the latest victims in a feeding cycle that would continue long after they were gone. The hidden room key that changed everything was exactly where Marcus said it would be, following his guidance and ignoring the increasingly agitated protests from the false spirits. Maya found the ornate skeleton key hidden inside the stone fireplace, wedged behind a loose brick that had been concealing it for decades. The key was different from the others she'd found, made of what appeared to be silver and inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly. "Rosalie hid it there before she died," Marcus explained, as Maya examined the strange key. "The real Whisper people told her where to put it, so the fake ones couldn't find it and throw it away." The key unlocked a door Maya had never noticed, a narrow opening behind the bookshelf in the main room. so perfectly concealed that it appeared to be just another section of log wall. Until the lock mechanism released and the hidden panel swung inward, beyond the door was a room that couldn't possibly fit within the cabin's exterior dimensions. A space that seemed to exist partially in the physical world and partially somewhere else entirely. Maya stepped into the room with Marcus close behind her, and immediately felt a profound shift in the spiritual atmosphere around them. Here, the oppressive weight that had been growing heavier each day was completely absent. The air was clean, almost purified, and for the first time since arriving at the cabin, Maya felt like she could breathe normally without the sensation of invisible hands pressing against her chest. "This is where the real whisper people live," Marcus said, his voice filled with relief. Maya could sense what he meant. The room was filled with presence, but not the hungry, manipulative energy of the false spirits. This felt genuinely protective, caring in the way that family should be. The walls were covered with writing from floor to ceiling, not carved symbols like those in the chamber below, but actual words written in various hands, multiple languages spanning what appeared to be centuries. Maya approached the nearest section and began reading entries that would completely overturn everything she thought she knew about her family's history. The earliest entries were in Spanish, dating from the 1600s, followed by sections in indigenous languages, then English accounts that began in the 1880s, with Hannah Carter's distinctive handwriting. But these weren't the desperate journal entries of victims being slowly consumed by a spiritual parasite. These were detailed records of a resistance movement that had been fighting the entity for generations. The entity we call the Sleeper is not native to this realm, Hannah's first entry read. It is a dimensional parasite that feeds on spiritual energy, and it arrived here through a tear created by the massacre of 1847. But it is not invincible, nor is it the true master of this land. Maya read entry after entry, learning that the keepers weren't victims. They were undercover agents, pretending to serve the entity while actually working to understand its weaknesses and develop weapons that could destroy it permanently. Each generation learns a little more, wrote a woman named Sarah Carter in 1923. The entity believes we are its willing servants, but we are actually its students, learning everything we can about its nature and methods. When we have accumulated enough knowledge, we will use that information to eliminate it forever. The most recent entries were in Rosalie's handwriting, documenting decades of careful research and preparation for what she called the final campaign. Maya will be the one, Rosalie had written. She has the medical background to understand what we're really dealing with, the analytical skills to process the accumulated research, and most importantly, she will arrive at the cabin with Marcus, a child whose psychic sensitivity is strong enough to serve as our secret weapon. Maya sank into a chair that somehow existed in this impossible room, overwhelmed by the scope of deception operating on multiple levels. The entity had been manipulating each keeper through false spiritual advisors, but the real keepers had been conducting their own counterintelligence operation. "Mama, look at this," Marcus said, pointing to detailed diagrams covering one wall. "It's a map of where the bad thing really lives." Maya studied the schematic of the entity's dimensional structure. It existed in a pocket dimension that overlapped with the physical world at this location. The chamber beneath the cabin was just the visible tip of something far more complex, a multidimensional organism extending through layers of reality. The diagrams also showed the entity's weaknesses, specific vulnerabilities, that could be exploited with sufficient knowledge and power. 5 generations of keepers had identified exactly how to hurt something that existed partially outside normal reality. The entity feeds on spiritual energy, but it cannot process certain types of purified life force, Rosalie had written. A keeper who has learned to work with the real ancestor spirits can channel energy that acts like poison to its system. As if summoned by Maya's understanding, figures began materializing around the room, solid, determined people who radiated the strength that comes from fighting a long war with purpose. The real Hannah stepped forward, and Maya immediately saw the difference between this spirit and the false advisor. "Welcome to the resistance," Hannah said, her voice carrying warmth and authority the false spirit had never possessed. "You are the 5th generation to discover this room, and you will be the last keeper who needs to carry this burden." But before Maya could respond, the room filled with oppressive presence. The entity itself materialized, a shifting mass of darkness with eyes holding centuries of accumulated hunger. "So, the latest generation has discovered the resistance movement," the entity said, its words carrying dimensional weight. How disappointing. And how utterly futile. Marcus stepped forward, his small form blazing with protective light that made the predator stagger backward. "No," Marcus said with absolute certainty. "You can't have her. You can't have any of us anymore." The entity's scream of rage filled the room, but Maya realized they had gained crucial advantage. The predator had revealed itself directly, abandoning the subtle manipulation that had been its greatest strength. "The final ceremony begins now," Hannah announced. "Maya, are you ready?" Maya looked at her son, holding back a dimensional predator through sheer protective love, and made the decision that would either save or damn them all. "I'm ready," she said. "Let's end this." The entity lunged toward Maya with supernatural speed, but the combined power of the real ancestor spirits created a barrier that held it back. For the first time in over a century, the dimensional predator found itself facing opponents who weren't afraid, weren't willing to be consumed, and most importantly, weren't fighting alone. Maya Carter had always been a fighter, but now she was about to become something more, the culmination of a resistance movement that had been generations in the making, armed with knowledge that could finally transform inherited trauma into lasting victory. The ritual instructions Maya found in the hidden room were more complex than anything she had imagined, requiring preparation that would test every skill she possessed as both a medical professional and a spiritual practitioner. The parchment was ancient, written in multiple hands across centuries, with detailed diagrams showing how to create what the real ancestor spirits called a purification matrix, a spiritual configuration that could channel purified life energy in concentrated doses powerful enough to poison the dimensional parasite that had been feeding on her family for generations. The entity's feeding system is also its greatest vulnerability, Hannah explained as Maya studied the intricate diagrams. It has adapted to consume the spiritual energy of willing victims, but it cannot process energy that has been purified through genuine love and sacrifice. Such energy acts as a toxin in its system, disrupting its ability to maintain dimensional stability. Maya spent weeks learning to distinguish between different types of spiritual energy, training with the real ancestor spirits to channel power that came from protective love rather than fear or desperation. The work was exhausting and often painful, requiring her to expose herself to the entity's influence, while maintaining enough spiritual purity to avoid being corrupted by contact with its feeding system. The training took place in the hidden room, where the entity's false spirits couldn't interfere or monitor her progress. Each session left Maya physically drained but spiritually stronger, her ability to channel purified energy growing more sophisticated with each attempt. You must learn to become a conduit for love itself, the real Hannah instructed during one particularly intense training session. Not just your love for Marcus, but the accumulated love of every keeper who sacrificed herself to protect others. The love of every parent who has ever chosen their child's welfare over their own survival. Maya discovered that her medical background provided an unexpected advantage in understanding the spiritual mechanics of what they were attempting. The purification protocol was essentially chemotherapy for a dimensional parasite, carefully targeted doses of energy that would be toxic to the entity while hopefully not destroying the person. delivering the treatment, but it was Marcus who provided the breakthrough that made the final ceremony possible. During one of their training sessions, Maya watched in amazement as her 9-year-old son began manipulating spiritual energy with the casual competence of someone who had been practicing for years rather than weeks. He could see the dimensional structure of the entity clearly, identify which of the ancestor spirits were real and which were false constructs, and most importantly, he could channel purified energy in ways that caused the false spirits visible distress. "The monster is scared of Marcus," Hannah told Maya during one of their evening strategy sessions. "His abilities are developing faster than it anticipated, and he represents a threat it doesn't know how to counter. Children with his level of psychic sensitivity are extremely rare, and the entity has never had to deal with one before." Maya understood that Marcus was indeed their secret weapon, but using a child in such a dangerous capacity went against every protective instinct she possessed. The thought of exposing her son to the kind of spiritual warfare they were planning made her physically ill. But Marcus himself seemed to understand the stakes involved better than Maya wanted to acknowledge. "Mama, if we don't stop it now, it's just going to keep eating people from our family forever," he said one evening as they prepared for bed. "And maybe someday it will get strong enough to start eating other families too. We're the only ones who know how to hurt it, so we have to be the ones who make it stop." The final preparation required gathering specific materials from locations across several states: soil from indigenous sacred sites, water that had never been exposed to industrial contamination, and plants that grew only in areas where the spiritual barriers between dimensions were naturally thin. Eleanor Crowfeather helped Maya obtain most of these items, traveling with her to reservation lands where tribal elders still maintain knowledge of the old ways. "What you are attempting has been tried before, in different places, against similar entities," Eleanor explained, as they collected spring water from a source that had been considered sacred for over 1,000 years. "Sometimes it succeeds, sometimes it fails. The difference usually comes down to whether the people performing the ceremony truly understand what they're fighting and why they're willing to risk everything to defeat it." Maya had no illusions about the risks involved. The ritual would require her to deliberately expose herself to the entity's feeding system, while channeling enough purified energy to poison it, a process that could easily kill her if she lost focus or if Marcus was unable to maintain his protective abilities throughout the ceremony. The false spirits had grown increasingly aggressive as Maya's preparation advanced, apparently sensing that their control over the situation was slipping. They no longer bothered maintaining the pretense of being helpful ancestor spirits, instead revealing themselves as the predatory constructs they had always been. "You will not escape your purpose," the fake Hannah raged during one particularly violent spiritual attack. "5 generations of your family have fed us willingly. You will not be the one to break that tradition." But the real ancestor spirits had grown stronger as well, their connection to Maya deepening as she learned to channel the type of energy they could actually use to manifest in the physical world. The hidden room became a fortress where Maya and Marcus could plan and prepare without interference from the entity's psychological warfare. Tom Birch proved unexpectedly helpful during this period, revealing that his family's knowledge of the supernatural situation was far more extensive than he had initially admitted. His grandfather had been present during one of the entity's previous feeding frenzies, had seen what happened when a keeper failed and the parasite broke free to consume an entire family. "My grandfather spent 60 years researching ways to kill that thing," Tom explained as he helped Maya arrange the ritual materials according to the specifications in Rosalie's instructions. "He never found the answer, but he passed down everything he learned. Said someday there'd be a keeper brave enough and smart enough to use that knowledge." Martha Henderson contributed supplies and emotional support, serving as a liaison with other townspeople who had decided they were tired of living in fear of supernatural reprisals. The entire community seemed to understand that Maya's battle was being fought on their behalf as well. If she succeeded, Cedar Hollow would finally be free from the shadow that had hung over it for over a century. Dr. Morrison provided medical support, creating a protocol for helping Maya recover from what everyone understood would be massive physical trauma if the ritual succeeded. He had studied Rosalie's medical records extensively and understood better than anyone else the toll that channeling large amounts of spiritual energy could take on the human body. What you're attempting is essentially spiritual surgery, he told Maya during one of their planning sessions. You're going to be operating on something that exists partially outside normal reality, using tools that could destroy you if you make a mistake. But if you succeed, you'll be saving not just your own family, but potentially hundreds of other people who might become victims if this thing continues to grow stronger. As the date approached for the final ceremony, Maya found herself experiencing a strange sense of peace. She had done everything possible to prepare, had gathered allies both living and dead, and had trained until she was as ready as anyone could be for such an undertaking. But it was the support of the real ancestor spirits that gave her the confidence to proceed. During their final planning session, Maya was surrounded by the ghosts of 5 generations of women who had pretended to be victims. While actually preparing for this moment, we have been waiting over a century for someone with your combination of skills and determination, Hannah told her. Medical training to understand what we're really fighting, analytical abilities to process the accumulated research, and most importantly, a child whose psychic abilities are strong enough to serve as our secret weapon. Maya looked at Marcus, who was calmly studying the ritual diagrams with the serious attention he brought to all important matters. Her son had grown over the past months from a sensitive child into something approaching a psychic prodigy, his abilities developing at a rate that amazed even the ancestor spirits who had been training him. Are you ready for this, baby? Maya asked. Marcus nodded solemnly. The real whisper people say it's going to hurt, but not for very long. And after it's over, we'll never have to be scared of the bad thing again. Maya understood that they were as prepared as they could possibly be. Tomorrow night, on the anniversary of her arrival in Cedar Hollow, she would either succeed in destroying a dimensional parasite that had been feeding on her family for over a century, or she would die in the attempt. But either way, the cycle of deception and spiritual predation that had claimed 5 generations of keepers would finally come to an end. Maya had made her choice, and she was ready to see it through to whatever conclusion awaited them. The ceremony began at sunset. Exactly 1 year after Maya had first heard whispers calling her name from within the cabin's walls. Maya stood in the chamber beneath the cabin, surrounded by the ritual materials she had spent months gathering and preparing. The space looked different now, where before she had seen symbols of containment and spiritual bondage. She now recognized the components of an elaborate trap that 5 generations of women had been building for their family's tormentor. The silver ceremonial blade that had belonged to Rosalie lay across the central focusing stone, its surface inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift and change when Maya wasn't looking directly at them. This was the tool that would allow her to cut through the dimensional barriers that protected the entity, exposing it to the purified spiritual energy that would serve as poison to its alien metabolism. Remember, Hannah's voice came from the gathering shadows around the chamber's perimeter. The entity will try to break your connection the moment it realizes what you're doing. You must maintain the link no matter how much pain it causes, no matter how desperately it tries to sever the feeding relationship. Maya nodded, understanding that the next few hours would be the most challenging of her life. She had trained extensively for this moment, but training could only prepare someone so much for deliberately opening themselves to consumption by a dimensional parasite while Simultaneously trying to poison it, Marcus stood at the eastern edge of the ritual circle, his small form somehow radiating power that made the air around him shimmer like heat waves. His role would be crucial. He was the only one present who could see the entity's true form clearly enough to guide Maya's spiritual attacks to their most vulnerable targets. "I can see it." "Mama," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the calm certainty he brought to all supernatural matters. "It's really big, bigger than I thought. And it's angry because it knows we're not scared of it anymore." Maya began the opening phase of the ritual, following instructions that had been refined through generations of planning and preparation. She arranged the sacred materials in the pattern shown in Rosalie's diagrams, lit candles made from beeswax and herbs that had been blessed by multiple spiritual traditions, and opened her consciousness to connection with both the dimensional parasite and the real ancestor spirits who had been waiting over a century for this moment. The experience was unlike anything Maya could have prepared for, even after months of training. The moment she established connection with the entity's feeding system, she felt its attention focus on her with predatory intensity. It was vast and ancient and utterly alien, a consciousness that viewed human beings as nothing more than convenient sources of the spiritual energy it needed to maintain its existence in this dimension. But Maya had learned to channel a type of energy the entity couldn't safely consume. Working with Hannah and the other real ancestor spirits, she began the process that would transform her from victim into weapon, opening herself to the parasites, feeding while simultaneously channeling purified life force that carried the concentrated love and protective determination of 5 generations of women who had pretended to be prey while actually preparing for war. The entity's reaction was immediate and violent. The chamber shook as dimensional barriers destabilized, and Maya could feel the parasite's confusion and growing alarm as energy that should have been familiar and nourishing instead began burning through its system like acid. "It's trying to pull back," Marcus called out, his voice somehow carrying clearly over the supernatural chaos that was building around them. "Don't let it escape, Mama. If it gets away now, it'll hide somewhere we can't reach it." Maya gripped Rosalie's ceremonial blade and used it to cut deeper into the dimensional fabric that separated the physical world from the entity's hiding place. Each cut sent waves of agony through her nervous system, but she could see that she was succeeding. The purified energy was flowing into the parasite's core systems, disrupting its ability to maintain the complex dimensional manipulations that had kept it safe for over a century. The false spirits launched their final assault, trying desperately to break Maya's concentration and save their creator from destruction. The fake Hannah appeared beside Maya, no longer bothering to maintain any pretense of benevolence. "Stop this madness," the construct commanded, its voice carrying supernatural authority that made Maya's bones ache. "You are destroying something that has existed since before your species learned to walk upright. What gives you the right to commit such cosmic murder?" But Maya had learned to recognize manipulation when she heard it, and she had the support of spirits who genuinely cared about her welfare rather than viewing her as a convenient meal. "You are not destroying a being," the real Hannah said, her presence strengthening Maya's ability to resist the false spirit's psychological assault. "You are removing a parasite that has been feeding on suffering for centuries. This is not murder, it is surgery." Maya maintained her connection to the entity's feeding system despite the increasing agony of channeling power that felt like liquid fire flowing through her veins. She could sense the parasite trying to sever its link to avoid further contamination, but the ritual had been designed to prevent exactly that escape. The purified energy continued flowing into its dimensional structure, disrupting the complex spiritual mechanics that allowed it to exist partially outside normal reality. "Now, Marcus," Maya called out as she felt the entity's defenses beginning to collapse. "Hit it with everything you have." Her son stepped forward, his small hands beginning to glow with a light that Maya had never seen before, not just purified spiritual energy, but something that felt like compressed starlight, the concentrated essence of every protective emotion a child could feel for the people he loved, the chamber filled with brilliance as Marcus channeled power that dwarfed anything Maya had managed during her months of training. The entity's psychic scream of pain and rage was felt rather than heard, a dimensional shriek that rattled the very foundations of reality in the space around the cabin. Maya could feel the parasite's life force beginning to unravel, its complex dimensional structure destabilizing as the toxic energy spread through systems that had never encountered anything they couldn't safely consume. For over a century, it had fed on spiritual energy contaminated by fear, despair, and resignation. Pure energy, motivated by love and sacrifice, and the determination to protect others, was literally poisonous to its alien metabolism. But the entity wasn't dying quietly. As its core systems began failing, it lashed out with everything it had remaining, trying to drag Maya and Marcus into dimensional collapse that would destroy all three of them simultaneously. "If I cannot feed," the parasite's voice echoed through multiple layers of reality, "then I will ensure that my destroyers do not survive to threaten others of my kind." Maya felt herself being pulled toward a dimensional vortex that would scatter her consciousness across multiple planes of existence. But she held on to the ritual connection with desperate determination. She had not come this far, had not risked everything, only to fail at the moment of victory. It was Rosalie's ceremonial blade that provided the final tool she needed to complete the entity's destruction. As the dimensional vortex threatened to tear Maya's consciousness apart, she felt the weight of her family's locket against her chest, the simple piece of jewelry that had belonged to Hannah and had been passed down through 5 generations of women who had carried burdens no one should have to bear alone. The locket began to glow with warm golden light, and Maya realized it had been more than just a family heirloom. It was a spiritual anchor, charged with the accumulated love and determination of every keeper who had worn it. Designed specifically for this moment when the final battle would require more strength than any single person could provide. "Use it." "Maya," Hannah's voice came from all around the chamber, as if the real ancestor spirits had temporarily merged their essence with the protective energy contained in the locket. "Channel our love, our sacrifice, our refusal to let this thing continue hurting innocent people." Maya pressed the locket against the ceremonial blade and felt power flow into the silver implement that was older and deeper than anything she had accessed before. This wasn't just her own spiritual energy, or even the combined strength of the ancestor spirits. It was the distilled essence of parental love, the fierce protectiveness that drives people to impossible acts of courage when those they care about are threatened. The entity's dimensional assault faltered as Maya struck back with this new level of power. The blade, now infused with 5 generations of protective love, cut through the parasite's defensive barriers like they were made of tissue paper rather than crystallized dimensional energy. "Marcus, now!" Maya shouted as she felt the entity's core defenses collapse entirely. Her son stepped into the center of the ritual circle, his own abilities magnified by the spiritual chaos that was tearing through the chamber. But instead of the raw power he had been channeling before, Marcus now wielded something more focused and infinitely more dangerous to the entity, the absolute certainty of a child who knew his mother would never let anything hurt him. The faith Marcus had in Maya's ability to protect him became a weapon that struck at the very heart of the entity's existence. The parasite had spent centuries feeding on fear, despair, and the resignation of people who believed they had no choice but to accept their fate as victims. Marcus's complete confidence that good would triumph over evil was antithetical to everything the entity understood about human nature. "No," Marcus said simply, his voice carrying across multiple dimensions with the kind of authority that comes from absolute moral certainty. "You can't have us. You can't have anyone. We won't let you." The combined assault, Maya's purified spiritual energy, guided by the locket's accumulated protective power, and Marcus's weaponized innocence and faith, proved to be more than the dimensional parasite could withstand. Its death cry was felt rather than heard, a psychic scream that shattered the false spiritual constructs it had maintained for over a century and sent tremors through multiple layers of reality. Maya felt the entity's presence imploding, its complex dimensional structure collapsing as the toxic energy she had been feeding it finally reached critical concentration in its core systems. The creature that had posed as a spiritual responsibility for her family was revealing itself in its death throes to be exactly what Rosalie had suspected, a sophisticated predator that had perfected the art of making its victims complicit in their own consumption. But as the entity died, it made one final attempt to ensure that its destroyers would not survive to threaten others of its kind. The dimensional tear that had allowed it access to the physical world began expanding rather than collapsing, threatening to create a permanent rift that could allow other parasites from its home dimension to invade this reality. The portal, Hannah's voice carried urgency that made Maya's heart race with new fear. You must seal it before it stabilizes, or you will have saved your family, only to doom countless others. Maya looked at the expanding dimensional rift and understood that closing it would require her to channel more energy than she had ever attempted, possibly more than her human form could survive. But the alternative was unthinkable. She had not fought this hard, had not risked everything, only to create a gateway for other dimensional predators to exploit. Marcus, I need you to help me, Maya said, her voice steady despite her growing exhaustion. We have to close that tear before anything else can come through. Her son nodded, with the same calm acceptance he had shown throughout their supernatural ordeal. Together, they placed their hands on the focusing stone at the center of the ritual circle and began channeling every bit of spiritual energy they could access, their own life force, the accumulated power of the ancestor spirits, and the protective love that had been stored in the family locket over the course of a century. The dimensional rift fought their efforts to close it, as if the very fabric of reality had been damaged in ways that wanted to remain torn. But Maya and Marcus persisted, pouring everything they had into the effort to heal a wound in existence itself. Slowly, gradually, the edges of the dimensional tear began to draw together. The process was agonizing, requiring Maya to channel more power than her nervous system was designed to handle, but she could feel progress being made. The rift was shrinking, its connection to the entity's home dimension weakening as the portal's structural integrity failed. Almost there, Hannah's voice provided encouragement that helped Maya maintain focus, despite the overwhelming pain of serving as a conduit for forces that existed beyond normal human comprehension. Hold on just a little longer. With a final surge of effort that left Maya temporarily blind from the strain, she and Marcus succeeded in closing the dimensional rift completely. The tear sealed with a sound like reality itself, sighing in relief, leaving behind only smooth spiritual space where the parasite's gateway had threatened to become a permanent invasion route. Maya collapsed, her strength completely drained by the effort of channeling enough purified energy to poison a dimensional predator and then seal the portal it had used to access their world. But she was alive, conscious, and most importantly, free, genuinely free for the first time since arriving at the cabin. Marcus helped her to her feet, his own psychic abilities apparently undiminished by the massive power he had channeled during the ceremony. Around them, the real ancestor spirits began to fade, their earthbound existence finally coming to an end as the threat they had remained to fight was eliminated forever. Thank you, Hannah said, as her form became increasingly translucent. You have given us something we had almost stopped believing was possible, the chance to rest, knowing that our sacrifice accomplished something meaningful. Maya watched the spirits of her ancestors fade peacefully into whatever came after death, Their century-long vigil finally ended. The chamber around her felt different, lighter, cleaner, as if a weight that had been pressing down on the very air had been permanently removed. "Is it over, Mama?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had been fighting battles far beyond his years. "It's over, baby," Maya replied, pulling her son into an embrace that felt like the first truly free gesture she had made since inheriting the cabin. "The monster is dead, the portal is closed, and we never have to be afraid of anything like this again." As they climbed the stairs from the chamber to the cabin's main floor, Maya realized that the whispers that had called her name for over a year had been replaced by ordinary household sounds, the wind moving through trees that no longer carried supernatural menace, the normal creaking and settling of a house that sheltered people who were genuinely free to choose their own destinies. The battle was over, and for the first time in 5 generations, the Carter family was no longer bound by inherited obligations to forces beyond their understanding. Maya and Marcus had not just survived their confrontation with a dimensional predator, they had won a victory that would echo through time, ensuring that no future members of their family would ever be deceived into believing that spiritual servitude was the price of keeping the world safe. They were free, and their freedom had been purchased not through submission to ancient patterns of predation, but through the revolutionary act of refusing to accept that some forms of suffering were inevitable. Maya had kept her promise to Marcus and to herself. She had given him choices rather than burdens, a future determined by love rather than inherited fear. The whispers in the walls had been silenced forever. 6 months later, Maya stood in the doorway of the cabin that had become a genuine home rather than a spiritual prison, holding a photograph that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. The new family portrait showed Maya and Marcus standing in front of the completely renovated cabin, surrounded by friends from Cedar Hollow who had become their chosen family. The structure behind them bore no resemblance to the decrepit monument to inherited trauma that had first greeted them. It was now a place where families could actually be happy, where children could grow up without carrying the weight of supernatural responsibilities they never chose. Marcus was thriving in ways that still amazed Maya. His abilities remained strong, but they had transformed from a burden of inherited sensitivity into genuine gifts that he used by choice rather than obligation. He helped classmates who were troubled, sensed when elderly neighbors needed assistance, and created art that seemed to capture the spiritual beauty of ordinary moments. But all of this work was voluntary, motivated by compassion rather than supernatural compulsion. "Look, Mama," Marcus said, showing her his latest drawing, a picture of their cabin surrounded by the gardens they had planted together, with no shadows or whispers or hidden chambers, just a home where people who loved each other could build whatever future they chose. "It looks happy now, doesn't it?" Maya nodded, remembering the first drawing Marcus had made of the cabin when it had appeared sad and lonely, weighed down by decades of spiritual servitude. The transformation in his art reflected the transformation in their lives, from isolation and fear to community and hope. Dr. Morrison had officially retired, turning his practice over to Maya with the understanding that her healing abilities were now enhanced by her experience with spiritual energy, but no longer connected to any supernatural binding. She helped people because helping others gave her genuine satisfaction and purpose, not because she was compelled to serve as a mystical guardian for forces beyond her control. The townspeople of Cedar Hollow had welcomed Maya's family completely, no longer viewing them with the mixture of sympathy and wariness that had characterized their early interactions. The hidden network of people who had supported the keeper system for generations had transformed into a genuine community that provided mutual support without the undercurrent of supernatural obligation that had previously defined those relationships. Birch had become Marcus's unofficial uncle, teaching him woodworking skills and helping Maya maintain the property without any of the ritualistic significance that had previously attached to such work. Martha Henderson served as a surrogate grandmother, sharing stories about local history that no longer carried hidden warnings about spiritual dangers lurking in family inheritances. Most significantly, Maya had established contact with former keeper families across the country, sharing the techniques that had allowed her to permanently resolve their supernatural obligations. The network that Rosalie had discovered through her correspondence was being transformed from a support group for victims into a resource for people who wanted to break free from similar patterns of spiritual predation. The entity we defeated was not unique. Maya had written in letters to families dealing with comparable situations. There are others like it in other places, using similar methods to ensure a steady supply of victims who believe they are serving a greater purpose. But they all share the same vulnerability. They cannot safely consume spiritual energy that has been purified through genuine love and sacrifice. 3 families had already succeeded in using Maya's purification protocol to eliminate their own supernatural parasites. 2 others were in various stages of preparation for similar ceremonies. The knowledge that had been accumulated over 5 generations of apparent victimhood was proving to be exactly what other trapped families needed to break free from cycles of inherited spiritual servitude. Eleanor Crow further visited regularly, bringing traditional foods and stories that helped Maya understand the broader context of what they had accomplished. According to tribal oral history, the defeat of the dimensional parasite had restored spiritual balance to an area that had been contaminated for over a century and a half. The land remembers everything that happens on it, Eleanor explained during one of their conversations. It remembers the original betrayal that created the wound your family has been healing, but now it also remembers the love and sacrifice that finally brought peace. This place will be protective rather than predatory for generations to come. Maya kept the locket that had belonged to Hannah, but it was no longer a focusing tool for supernatural rituals. It was simply a family heirloom that connected her to ancestors who had sacrificed everything to ensure future generations could live freely. Sometimes, when the evening light hit it just right, Maya thought she could see faces reflected in its surface, women who had carried impossible burdens with grace and courage, who had found ways to transform inherited trauma into lasting healing. The chamber beneath the cabin had been sealed, its stones relocated to create a memorial garden where Maya and Marcus grew herbs and vegetables for their own use and to share with neighbors. The space that had once focused spiritual energy for a dimensional predator now nurtured life in the most ordinary and beautiful ways possible. But it was the silence that Maya treasured most. The whispers that had once called her name from within the cabin's walls had been replaced by normal household sounds. Marcus practicing piano, the radio playing softly in the kitchen, the ordinary creaking and settling of a house that sheltered people who were truly free to choose their own destinies. On quiet evenings, Maya would sit on the porch that Tom had rebuilt, watching Marcus play in the yard that had once been overgrown with the neglect of spiritual servitude, and reflect on how completely their lives had changed. They had arrived at the cabin as desperate refugees from urban poverty, expecting nothing more than basic shelter and the chance to start over. Instead, they had discovered a calling that allowed them to break a cycle of inherited trauma and transform their home into a place of genuine healing, not just for themselves, but for others who found themselves trapped in similar situations. Maya's nursing skills had evolved into something broader and more meaningful, a practice that combined medical knowledge with understanding of how spiritual wounds could be healed through love and community support. The forest around their home was full of ordinary sounds now, birds singing, Wind moving through healthy trees, small animals going about their daily business without the supernatural interference that had once made even wildlife avoid the area. Maya listened to those sounds each evening as she and Marcus prepared dinner together, grateful for the simple blessing of normality that had been earned through courage, sacrifice, and the unshakable conviction that love was stronger than any force that sought to consume it. Marcus was already talking about what he wanted to be when he grew up. Maybe a doctor like his mother, maybe an artist, maybe both. The important thing was that he had choices, real choices, unencumbered by inherited obligations or supernatural responsibilities that previous generations had assumed were unavoidable. "Do you think other kids will ever have to fight monsters like we did?" Marcus asked one evening as they worked together in their memorial garden. "I hope not," Maya replied. "But if they do, they'll know it's possible to win. They'll know that sometimes the most important battles are fought not by accepting the roles that others design for us, but by having the wisdom and courage to rewrite the scripts that previous generations assumed were unchangeable." Maya Carter had always been a fighter, but now she was something more, a liberator, someone who had taken inherited burdens and transformed them into lasting freedom. The responsibility she had accepted out of desperation had become a gift she could offer to others, proof that even the most ancient patterns of spiritual predation could be broken by people who were willing to fight with love rather than fear. Their story had begun with desperate choices made by people who had nowhere else to turn. It ended with the understanding that sometimes the most profound victories come not from accepting inherited fate, but from refusing to let historical patterns of suffering determine the future for people you love. Maya and Marcus Carter were free, and their freedom had been purchased not through submission to supernatural forces, but through the revolutionary act of choosing love over fear, healing over containment, and the future over the past. The whispers in the walls had been silenced forever, replaced by the sound of a family choosing its own destiny.